I'm a housemaid. Housemaids must be invisible. That's essential to our profession. The food must be cooked. Meals must appear on the table. The dishes must be washed. The house cleaned. The children prepared for school in the morning. Who does it? No one. The invisible housemaid. If, while serving at the table, I hear a conversation about something that I have an opinion on, I must shut up. Besides being invisible, I must be mute and deaf. I never hear my employers talking. In the afternoon, when we were rehearsing, a man came to me and showed me where I should stand or move for the lights to illuminate me better, so that I would be seen by all the spectators. Another man hung a small microphone on my dress to make my voice be heard throughout the theater. For the first time in my life, people were busy, making me visible, making me audible. In the evening, wonder of wonders. The family I work for were all there, seeing my body, listening to my voice, understanding my thoughts, my feelings. They were there in the audience. They were silent in the dark. I cried when I came to the dressing room and looked at myself in the mirror. I saw a woman. For the first time in my life, I saw a woman in the mirror. Before looking at the mirror, I used to see a housemaid. Tonight, I saw a woman. I am a woman. This is the real story of Mary, a housemaid who participated in a Theatre of the Oppressed group in Brazil. And I think that it encapsulates the crux of what the Theatre of the Oppressed is. Here you can see Augusto Boal in one of his activities. He was a Brazilian director and playwright. Of course, he was influenced by Paulo Freire and the pedagogy of the oppressed. And I think that this story says a lot about the theater of the oppressed and primarily the humanism that we see both in Freire and Boal, right? It's a process of rehumanization, right? A critique of dehumanization and subhumanism. The main idea of the theater of the oppressed is that Boal attempted to criticize the distinction between the spectator, who is in the audience and is passive, and the actor, who is active. For that reason, he introduced several techniques. I won't analyze all of them. Image theater, forum theater, newspaper theater, legislative theater, and invisible theater. The most popular of these forms is called forum theater. But what is a forum theater? It's a theatrical act prepared by professional actors, amateur actors, or in general, members of a theater of the oppressed group that is repeated several times and the audience participate in all the next endeavors. The idea is that reality is not static, but there are several alternatives to it. And they're usually used together. But forum theater is the most popular. There are several variations of this, but the central idea is that there are no spectators, right? And all of these approaches address oppression in a way or another. So I think that critical realism is now in a dialogical zeitgeist. There are dialogues with other approaches like phenomenology, Bourdieu, integral theory, Nordic eco-philosophy, and other approaches as well. And this year I had the opportunity to use the theater of the oppressed in Lillehammer in Norway. And for that, I would like to thank Lee Price and the Crisis Research Center there. So the question that I wanted to ask is, what happens if we try to extend this dialogue beyond philosophy and the social sciences to a theatrical approach? And what can we learn from each other, practitioners of the theater of the oppressed and people interested in critical realism, from the successes, the failures, and the challenges that these bodies of knowledge have encountered? So I think that there are for me, there are four thematic areas through which we can think of the relationship between these two forms of knowledge. The one is what I would describe as totalistic metacritiques. And by that, I mean that both are interested in criticizing the entire philosophical and theatrical tradition. When it comes to critical realism, we know the critiques of the epistemic fallacy and the neglect of absence as the primordial failings of Western philosophy. But I would like to focus more on the theater of the oppressed that is not that popular. Boal criticizes Aristotle, Hegel, and Brecht and their influence on theater. He suggests that the Aristotelian poetics is influential today in the way we do arts in general and theater in specific. So let's start with the Aristotelian definition of tragedy that was to be so influential. Aristotle defined tragedy as an act that is serious, complete, and of a great magnitude. It provokes emotions of pity and fear, and it leads to emotional catharsis. From an emancipatory perspective, there are several problems with this. The first is that usually in tragedies, we see the restoration to normality. There is the return to normal. For instance, Prometheus steals the fire, gives it to human, then he's punished by the gods, right? This is a common theme in most ancient tragedies. From an emancipatory perspective, this is problematic, right? Any disruptive antisocial element at the end of a tragedy is eliminated somehow. Another problem is that if we define theater as acts of great magnitude, that means that people, ordinary people, are excluded, right? We are talking about extraordinary acts performed by extraordinary people. Demigods like Prometheus, rulers like Oedipus, or members of the royal family like Hamlet. But in the theater of the oppressed, we are interested in the stories of Mary, the housemaid, right? Not only in influential people. That, of course, Boal described this as a powerful, coercive system of intimidation, because the effect of a play, of a tragedy, is to create emotions of pity and fear to the audience. Pity for the tragedy of the tragic hero, and fear that this might happen to me or to anybody else as well. This already creates a power inequality, right? The spectator delegates the power to act to the actor. And a third problem is that there are also multiple layers of oppression. It's not just the spectator and the actor, but within the actors, there are hierarchical inequalities. For instance, the chorus and the protagonist. The chorus was composed of 12 to 15 performers, but they were only there to comment on the action of the protagonist. So they had a more passive role. So there are internal contradictions within actors as well. So I was thinking about the overlap with critical realism, and I think that both forms of knowledge seem to have a cosmohistorical significance. They emerged in the 70s. Critical realism as the end of ontological science and epistemic fallacy, and a Copernican revolution in philosophy. And the theater of the oppressed as what Boal would describe as the emancipation of the spect actor. Boal was using this neologism of spect actor, right? He was not accepting the word spectator. So I think that it's extremely difficult, if not impossible, to understand the influence of these approaches without a deep knowledge of the entire history that has preceded them. I think that we also have to understand the specific socioeconomic and historical context in which this approach is emerged. And I think that I have to refer to the crisis of the socialist left. For Bhaskar, we know that he was interested in politics. Several of his friends were in the Labour Party. And he saw critical realism as a renewed argument for socialism, a way to reappropriate reality in times when it was used in problematic ways or dismissed. Augusto Boal also participated in politics in Rio de Janeiro. And I think that we have to see the theater of the oppressed as a formal critique of the Brazilian Communist Party, and in particular, the undemocratic structure of the Brazilian Communist Party, at least if we compare it with the horizontal participatory way through which the theater of the oppressed works. And also as when it comes to the inability of the Brazilian Communist Party to predict the military dictatorship and offer a solution, like an alternative to that. But I think that the theater of the oppressed is better seen as a moment and a method of critical pedagogies in Latin America in general. not only Freire's pedagogy of the oppressed, but liberation theology, liberation psychology, participatory action research that was developed by the Colombian scholar Fals Borda, and all other approaches that, successfully or not, but they try to overcome the oppressive contradictions that we see in all social relations, theater, research, pedagogy, etc. So the theater of the oppressed is, Boal would say that it's not the revolution, but it's a rehearsal for the revolution. Why? Because spectators have the power to experiment with solutions on the stage. So another component I would add is that we need to understand the predicaments and the failures of the socialist left to have a deeper understanding of both approaches. Also, they are both part of the dialectical tradition. I would use the word here, I would make the distinction between dialectical theater and dramatic theater. What we see in dramatic theater that is dominant is subjects that are autonomous, that are free. Right? They are not conceived dialectically as both objects, subjects, and objects of social conditions. Theater of the oppressed is a dialectical method, but what you usually see in forum theaters is rather the dominance of dramatic theater, which is a contradiction. For instance, when we use the theater of the oppressed and the spectator intervenes, and we want to discuss, for instance, domestic violence, and the spectator takes the position of an actor, a woman, for instance, who experiences domestic violence and just chooses to abandon the house and leave her husband. This does not capture the complexity when we make decisions in the real society, right? It's a form of abstract heroism where the fault is on the oppressed to act. When it comes to dialectics and critical realism, so this is a failure of the theater of the oppressed in the way that it's implemented. There is a kind of moralization of politics. We maintain the distinction between the oppressed and the oppressor, but it's a bit moralized, where the oppressor is an impossibly evil caricature, and the oppressed always have a choice. So we need a more dialectical dramaturgy. When it comes to critical realism, Nori also suggests that it's only a mild overstatement to describe dialectical critical realism as the forgotten term in Bhaskara's work, a squeeze between the two standpoints. Absence in general, that is a concept important in dialectical critical realism. I was reading this wonderful book. It's a very good introduction to absence. Han does not refer to Bhaskara, but he gives several examples from Japan, China, and other philosophies of the Far East. And he also says that even like Western thinkers like Heidegger and Derrida, they try to criticize the metaphysics of presence, but they are still limited, right? They are still constrained by Western thinking to a certain extent. So the crisis of dialectics, I think, is another milestone that we have to think about. And the last, I think the last theme, the last math category I would like to address is popularization. Here we see the website of the Roy Bhaskar Center. It says that it's philosophy for the many, not the few. Augusto Boal would also say in an ironic and humorous way that everybody can do theater, even actors themselves. Also, we can say that everybody can do philosophy, everybody can do critical realism, even critical realists, right? He was saying this to criticize the hyperspecialization and the problems it creates. Critical realism is becoming more and more popular, right? We have workshops, interviews, podcasts. We know that there are more and more people who download articles from the Journal of Critical Realism. Theater of the oppressed is probably the most, or one of the most popular theatrical approaches all over the world. It has been implemented to themes like racism, poverty. Boal used it, he primarily worked in favelas, in local communities. I think that popularization is a double-edged sword, but I think that we shouldn't reject it per se. On the other hand, I think that all emancipatory philosophies or theatrical approaches, right, they have to be accessible to more and more people. On the other hand, I think that there are problems. For instance, the mechanics of cooptation. When these approaches are made accessible, they usually lose their revolutionary radical core. And another problem is dogmatic metaphysics. And by that, I refer to the tendency to understand these approaches as static, not as in a constant flux, right? Not as breathing, living systems of interrelated categories. Boal understood this problem, and Paulo Freire as well. And he made a distinction that I think it might be important to critical realism as well. For instance, when it comes to the political diversity in critical realism and how we can stretch it. Boal was very skeptical when the theater of the oppressed was used by people who work at human resources departments, for instance, to address conflicts between employers and employees. He made a distinction between creative heresies and unforgivable betrayals, saying that this is an unforgivable betrayal because it neglects all the philosophical and political background of the theater of the oppressed. But as these forms of knowledge become popular, that doesn't mean that they are equally accessible to all. Moltz, in a book that is about meta theory, integral theory, and critical realism, asked this question: why are not, for instance, so many people from the global south interested in meta theory or other social categories? And Todd, an indigenous feminist thinker, she introduced the concept of a citational rebellion, suggesting that we have to engage with the entire spectrum of human thought, not with some specific social categories only. And to conclude, as somebody who is interested in critical realism and the theater of the oppressed, I think that when we practice the theater of the oppressed, we miss what we describe as meta-level epistemic reflexivity. There is a lot of reflexivity about what's going on in a theater of the oppressed group, but usually it stays at the level of individual experience. Freire was critical of this misapplication of his own approach, saying that the pedagogy of the oppressed is not a celebration of individual experience, and we cannot stay at this level. So I think that a meta-level epistemic reflexivity of what's going on in the theater of the oppressed group would be very interested. As somebody who is interested in theater as well, I think that the philosophical discourse sometimes tends to be disembodied. It does not engage with aesthetic sensory experiences that much. This is also a limitation. So I think that on the one hand, the intellectualization of being that we find in the philosophical discourse, and on the other hand, the aestheticization of being that we find in aesthetic mediums like theater or arts, they all have limitations. Thank you.